The notion of precarity has emerged as a way of describing the effects of neoliberal policy on the human condition. The concept not only expresses the sense that the state has broken its ideological promise, or what Polanyi posited as the Great Transformation, to ameliorate the misery of capitalism, capitalism necessarily generates, but also the embodied experience of living under a regime of economic uncertainty, increased militarization, and environmental destruction. While theorized as an effect of current conditions, I understand precarity as an extension of the structures and logics of settler colonialism. Indeed, over the past 10 years, I've gained a deeper, even more visceral understanding of the ways in which precarity manifests through the strategies of elimination, exclusion, abandonment, displacement, and desubjectification, particularly among the aged. This is a picture of my mom and dad. Wasn't sure what picture to show of my mom. She doesn't typically drink margaritas, but she had just gotten out of the hospital, I think, on this. And so we always celebrated like another moment, another time, another kind of more days that she was afforded. And that's my always dapper dad. In 2005, I joined the growing legion of 65.7 million family caregivers in the United States. First, my ever-stoic dad suffered a series of acute illnesses, a mild heart attack, and stroke-precipitated aortic valve replacement surgery. A year later, he was diagnosed with stomach cancer, for which he underwent 2 surgeries, the second resulting from a surgical error committed in the first. Also around that time, my beloved mom, already a breast cancer survivor, began to suffer a series of chronic and acute illnesses. Her struggles through pulmonary fibrosis, glaucoma, rheumatoid arthritis, and dementia contributed to a series of falls, the last of which was catastrophic and ultimately fatal. While my parents were never sick at the same time, their turn-taking extended the experience of precarity across the decade in a manner that seemed to mirror the unremitting spate of crisis and disaster in the external world, one after the next after the next. Because of its association with crisis, the elder care relationship is often constructed as a subtractive experience, selfless work riddled with material and spiritual costs for both the giver and the receiver. But while at many times very difficult, there was nothing about my experience that felt like an evisceration or lessening of self. Most of the time, I felt only that I was gripping tightly to a shared experience of mutuality, a life of togetherness that I was unwilling to trade for its absence, its void. Together we pushed back, resisted, and refused the indignities of a system intent on apprehending the end of my mother's life. For me, caregiving, or doing the work to let live, as well as hospicing, doing the work to let die, was transformative. That is, while the embers of loss smoldered beneath our struggles, I found them to be unexpectedly redemptive in their resistances, refusals, and acquiescences. So I started to think about how and why such additive experiences are made to disappear, rendered virtually illegible through the frames of settler colonialism. As the elderly across all racial and ethnic groups constitute the fastest growing segment of the population, it will become increasingly important to think critically about aging and the work of caregiving. According to the Administration on Aging, by the year 2030, the ratio of older adults, or those 65 and older, to adults, those between 24 and 64 years, will increase by 80%, so that 1 out of every 5 people in the United States will be considered an older adult. By 2050, the same population will increase worldwide from 680 million to 2 billion. That is doubling from 11 to 22%. Such unprecedented demographic shifts have activated deep anxieties, particularly among global superpowers who portend the coming, quote, demographic storm as one poised to threaten nations' abilities to maintain global security. Indeed, the World Bank began forecasting geopolitical decline nearly 20 years ago in its report, Averting the Old Age Crisis, Policies to Protect the Old and Promote Growth, in which old age and growth are situated along the capitalist binary of peoples or profits. Findings from this report fueled others, which collectively started to reference the 2030 problem. That's the year that 1 out of every 8 people in the world will be age 65 and over, as a sort of fiscal cliff. The concerns tend to circulate around a constellation of questions that include: how do we maintain global dominance under conditions of a declining workforce and increased social expenditures? How can we reconfigure aging and the aged as the next frontier for capital? How can science isolate and treat the disease of aging, and what new technologies can be developed to, quote, cure it? While one expects such ageism as common sense politics to emerge from within settler logics, this paper aims to call attention to the conspicuous absence of a counter-discourse in politics from within Native studies, especially among social and political theorists. Within Indigenous communities, elders have always held places of distinction as knowledge keepers, spiritual and political leaders, as attendants of past, present, and future generations. They are poignant reminders of the failures of elimination and living witness to the multitude of crimes committed against their humanity. And as such, they are the inconvenient truths, the undead, the anemic traces, and ciphers of the absent but seething presence of over 500 years of settler domination. They're so critical to the political project of Indigenous resurgence that sometimes I wonder if we need witness protection programs. Thus, the dearth of socio-political theories of aging within Native studies is problematic, deeply limiting the fund of knowledge available that we have to bear on activating what Mignolo refers to as the decolonial option. Through the structures and logics of the settler capitalist state, the aging body can only be viewed as a crisis of decreased labor power and increased social expenditure, an amortization that has only worsened under neoliberalism. But when disarticulated from this context, the aging massive exposes a unique opportunity and conceptual opening to rethink, if not restructure, some of the central dichotomies and contradictions that we endure. The centrality of work to existence, of economic growth to production, of production to wage labor, of age to declining yield, and ultimately of life beyond the productivist logics of capital. The hope is that such a radical rethinking may move us closer toward decolonial existences, more substantively defined by Indigenous relations of mutuality, responsibility, and reciprocity. This paper thus serves as a clarion call to social and political theorists and philosophers working with Native and Indigenous studies to not only pay attention to aging as an important aspect of subaltern identity, but also to undertake its analysis as a means of discerning and disrupting such settler relations of being. Toward this end, I begin with a brief survey of the literature on biopolitics as it has emerged across the sciences and social sciences. Then I discuss the geopolitical implications of biopolitical constructions of aging. And finally, I end with a discussion of alternative/competing views of aging within Indigenous communities. So this is the section on the biopolitics of geopolitics. While articulations of biopolitics precede Foucault, his groundbreaking text, The History of Sexuality, and subsequent lectures on security, territory, population, and the birth of biopolitics serve as touchstones in a vast array of scholarship that has emerged across multiple fields, examining the relationship among politics, life, the state, and the body. Though a varied and contested construct even within Foucault's own writing, the birth of biopolitics signaled the entrance of modernity and the rupture from sovereign forms of power. Whereas the sovereign held the absolute right to kill, or to make, die, and let live, modern conceptualizations of life aim to maximize life through disciplinary apparatuses and effective administration of the population, which is to say, to make, live, and let die. In the aftermath of 9/11, Foucault's analyses of the ways in which domination operates in the modern world served as a theoretical ground for new formations of biopolitics, most notably Agamben's insertion of a politics of death, or thanatopolitics, seeks to make biopolitics legible through the figure of the homo sacra and the negative power of exception. Hart and Negri's analysis takes biopolitics beyond the geographic bounds of the nation-state into the metaphysical and social fields of power in their construction of biopolitics as biopotenza. And Memby's work on necropolitics examines how the social and political space of global capitalism is managed and organized by the logic of death, shifting the central problematic of biopolitics from make, live, and let die to let live and make die. Cutting across all of these permutations are Indigenous theorizations that call attention to the relative failure of other paradigms to situate colonialism as a foundational context for biopower. You can see Mark Rifkin's or Scott Morganson's work in this area. Insofar as biopolitics is also concerned with the management of illness, health, and vitality, it's also taken up within the hard sciences. The focus here is on examples is to, quote, compress morbidity, which is to say shorten the length of time between an individual's ability to live at full capacity and their death. Consider, for example, the newly established biotech company Calico, which is short for California Life Company. Just started in 2013 by Google Incorporated and Arthur D. Levinson, who's the CEO of Apple. Together with Big Pharma, partners in Calico aim to, quote, cure death. Currently operating as a secret division of Google, Calico has been busy formalizing partnerships with leading scientists, universities, and private businesses, including Ancestry.com, to build the largest genomic database in the world. The questions raised by the ambitions of a private corporation, as deeply imbricated into the fabric of our lives as Google, working to solve the, quote, disease of aging and the, quote, problem of human finitude are ominous. How much will eternal life cost? Who will have access to such technologies? And more pointedly, who will die in order to let live? Such questions are of course, not only deeply ageist, but ableist, and always and already racialized, particularly in austerity regimes where divestments in health and welfare disproportionately impact the Black, brown, and poor. At the same time, neoliberal windfalls situate the white and wealthy as the target market for anti-aging technologies. The sciences have long served as one of the central apparatuses of biopolitical control, and the settler state not simply legitimating processes of making live and let die, but also those that mark certain bodies as property and others as human surplus. In other words, the sciences are deeply implicated in the imperialist processes of making race and nation, and thus not at all surprising that the renewed, if not urgent, focus on STEM disciplines has arisen in response to the most recent crisis of capitalism. This emergent nexus between biopolitics, geopolitics is more closely examined in the following section. The crisis of global aging has activated myriad shifts in governmentality. More specifically, anxieties about the declining labor force have instigated a surge in demographic analytics that compulsively compare national and global rates of longevity against falling birth rates. The result is a complex and pressured analysis that fuels a discourse of aging as crisis, one that engenders hyperbolic proclamations of zero GDP growth and stagnating entrepreneurship. This is that sort of fiscal cliff, and a coming generational war that pits young adults against aged adults over declines in profit margins. Consider, for example, the following Hunger Games-like prediction issued in a report by the Washington-based think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. They write, quote, faced with the choice between economically ruinous tax hikes and politically impossible benefit cuts, many governments will choose a third option, cannibalizing other spending on everything from education and the environment to foreign assistance and national defense. The aged, in other words, will plunder the earth. Such discourse is reminiscent of the ways in which Indianness was and is constructed as inherently disruptive to the settler state, necessitating policies of protection enacted as removal and other forms of dispossession. Similarly, some states have begun to parlay the coming demographic storm into policies of dispossession across a range of different policies that mandate the privatization of retirement savings, others that calculate what they call population offsets through replacement migration strategies. But perhaps the most disturbing among these is the emergence of social impact bonds, which are aimed at creating new markets for capital predicated on the conversion of human surplus into subprime subjects. More specifically, SIBs are the dream child of philanthrocapitalists who market them as an innovative means of harnessing private capital toward addressing persistent social ills such as homelessness, prison recidivism, juvenile delinquency, and eventually, I predict, long-term care. The bonds are secured through contracts between governments and venture capitalists who serve as intermediaries, managing the nonprofit service providers and holding them accountable for achieving the mutually agreed upon objectives. So one example, or the ways that they were, part of the way in which they were originally conceived is in underdeveloped, quote unquote, poor countries. They would develop a system of social impact bonds that would give directly to poor families money, bonds, in the form of bonds. And every time a child reached a certain benchmark, passed 6th grade, get an education, achieved a job, there would be the life of the bond would be renewed and there would be a greater return on the investment. So you're sort of trading, investors are trading upon subjects and calculating risks of how these subjects might perform, just live life. So in short, SIBs propose a new technology which, where governments are permitted to pay private investors for services that they already or should be obligated to provide. 2, persons are fully amortized, whereby the body is reconstituted as a potential investment and future dividend. And 3, quote, subprime populations are tied to profit making in ways that are even more brazenly premised on the continuation of racial colonialist subjugation. Thus, despite the feel-good discourse, SIBs mark a new and dangerous border in the neoliberal restructuring of the public sphere through private sector logics, by prefiguring the poor and disadvantaged as morally, physically, and/or intellectually incapable of embodying the traits that distinguish the proper economic subject. In her article, Pre-Black Futures, Catherine Mitchell exposes such strategies as enactments of a racialized biopolitics, whereby whiteness is reconstituted through the capacity to control one's exposure to future risks. That is, the landscape of risk and its avoidance is highly racialized through structures that create differential access to various social protections, such as credit, insurance, safe working environments, preferential or predatory mortgage lending. Social impact bonds tacitly trade upon this racialized difference by mapping calculations of good and bad risk onto the human subject, a scheme that creates a market of subprime bodies whose vulnerabilities are exploited for new opportunities for capital accumulation. Aside from the obvious, the significance of the emergence of SIBs to my discussion is the way in which it illustrates how, 1, capitalism will never resolve its own contradictions, 2, that primitive accumulation has never ended, and 3, that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. But at the heart of this paper are questions about how such neoliberal intensifications impact the organization and administration of care, particularly of the elderly. Under the Fordist Keynesian order, the state invested in the upkeep of the predominantly white male worker's body through pensions, healthcare, housing, etc., and as such helped to construct discourses of the aged as a deserved class, the greatest generation that worked so hard for self and country that they earned its social security in later life. Under the neoliberal regime, such entitlements have been recast as costs, if not debts, owed by the worker to the state as essentially the price for getting old. Thus, as individuals increasingly suffer the consequences of federal and corporate divestment, they are also under psychological assault that insidiously correlates, quote, healthy aging with taking care of oneself. Discourses of self-care have emerged as part of the common parlance in the mid to late 80s and have now come so normalized that it's sometimes even invoked as a radical stance toward the self and one's needs. Nevertheless, it's important to understand such discourses as a critical accomplice to the structural adjustments undertaking the neoliberal economy, particularly as they relate to the crisis of aging. Not surprisingly, definitions of successful aging also emerged in the mid-80s, exemplified in the work of Rowe and Kahn, whose largely biomedical definition of successful aging as free of disease and disability became normative, serving as the basis for further research and practice. Such positive models of aging were advocated as a fetter to stereotypes of the elderly as passive and dependent. But the reality is that they emerged through particular political and biomedical networks in the US that were aligned with corporatist agendas to raise the retirement age and lessen government expenditure. The net effect is an economic and ideological system that reifies individualism through its attachment to constructions of health and success. One that was, of course, initially set in motion over 500 years ago with settler invasion. Insofar as the intensification of biopolitics under neoliberalism represents an extension of the settler project, indigenous perspectives on aging are crucial. Not in the liberal sense of adding culturally relevant models for the sake of pluralism, but as a rupturing, a decolonial option to the dehumanizing logics of capitalism in the settler state. Relations of responsibility, collectivity, mutuality, and reciprocity are foundational to indigenous protocols and practices, giving rise to a number of important distinctions regarding life, death, and beingness. With the rising population of elderly within native communities, It's an important moment to think through these distinctions and the potential to inform the broader struggles of Indigenous resurgence. Aging in Indigenous communities is not yet, at least, experienced or understood as a crisis, primarily because the aged are not generally viewed as a distinctive population, though elders are. Conducting research on aging in Indigenous communities is not as simple as researchers sewing up and gathering demographic data on all individuals 65 and older, though such a study would indeed garner results on the biomedical state of elderly among the native population. And while even those studies are scant, the literature perpetuates deficit models of Indigenous peoples as disproportionately impacted by disease and disability. But more careful examinations of the elders, not just the elderly, or those identified by their communities as knowledge keepers and resources of generational and traditional knowledge, a different paradigm begins to emerge. More specifically, across the relatively few studies of aging within Indigenous communities, a pattern of belief emerges around aging as an integral moment in the cycles of life, not temporarily ordered along a linear lifespan. For instance, as found by Lewis's studies in 2010 among Alaska Natives, the definition of elder is not based on chronological age, but rather is a designation or honor bestowed by the community, a status earned through unspoken rules regarding wisdom, experience, and contribution to community. As distinguished by one woman in the study, some of us merely become elderly, but others become elders. Even more distinctive, the state of being elderly is viewed as equal vulnerability and sensitivity to environmental disturbance. The notion of elder as moving back toward the Creator and the spiritual realm in this passage provides a conceptual opening for rethinking biomedical models of what it means to be of sound mind. Indeed, preliminary research on dementia and other so-called diseases of the mind within Indigenous communities suggests competing ideas of what it means to be sound. For example, in their work with the Oklahoma Choctaw, Henderson and Henderson report that there's no word for the loss of one's mind or intellect in Choctaw. In fact, memory loss is not considered a loss at all, but rather a condition where the person's mind is simply perceived as being elsewhere. The researchers surmise that cultural environments that include supernatural connections to the spirit world as a matter of routine life experience demonstrate a greater tolerance, if not value, for what appears to be irrational behavior, developing alternative explanations for dementia-related conditions as being in communication with the other side. Thus, the fluid dynamic systems of cognitive travel between the empirical and non-empirical environments within many Indigenous communities generates a positive specialness about what is going on with their elders. Among conditions associated with aging, I am particularly interested in Indigenous views of mental capacity, not only because my own mom, or Ona as we called her, was diagnosed with dementia, but also because of the potential insights to how settler logics are transited through the constructions of reason, the mind, and its supposed loss. In 2012, the World Health Organization identified dementia as a, quote, public health priority, seemingly casting elders with memory loss as a greater socio-political risk to than the historical amnesia of the settler state, even as it increasingly suffers the relentless animus of its own denial. To the degree that normative theories of democracy and the apologue of modern liberalism situate reason, or more specifically the reasonable man, as the topos of sovereignty, it's a key site of the hegemonic power of settler logics. In this sense, the aged, vessels of diminished reason, represent a different kind of crisis for the settler state. The thought of a society with skyrocketing populations of centenarians is so disturbing to a system built upon the myths of rationality that it is already developing strategies of containment. Sadly, settler logics are so hegemonic that they are beginning to supplant these more traditional understandings of what it means to be an elder in Native communities. In his research, Lewis found emerging generational distinctions between non-elders who place a greater emphasis on health status and aging, and elders who emphasize what they would refer to as well-being, or a state understood as the ability to give back, of being able to share, be happy, and pass on what you know. Similarly, the work of Foucault suggests that as biomedical models of disease infiltrate communities, either through dislocation or outreach programs, what was once perceived as a spiritual state of being elsewhere is increasingly being understood as disease in need of medical care. As a result, families are becoming convinced that they can no longer care for the elders at home, setting in motion yet another removal of elders out of homes and into institutional care. The notion of communities without elders, without the crucial connective tissue between generations to ancestors in the spirit world, is an unimaginable loss, and a development that urgently calls for our collective attention. I feel privileged to have been by Ona's side as she journeyed elsewhere, traveling back and forth from the spirit world, reporting back in vivid detail her every excursion. During the Ukrainian crisis, she traveled to the Oval Office to provide counsel to the president. She often went back home to enjoy the beauty of her community, and once she went back to school, where she described herself as working very hard to please her teachers. Throughout her end of days, Ona spoke in multiple tongues, English, Spanish, Quechua, moving unencumbered across her lifespan. And one time she even relived in very vivid detail the experience of giving birth. As the so-called disease of dementia progressed, I watched her gain a deeper sense of herself, becoming ever more powerful and cognizant of where she had been and where she was going. A thoroughly syncretic being, Ona agilely and dutifully traversed between her traditional and Catholic faiths. She dreamed about one day going to Rome and visiting the Vatican, so she could hold it in both awe and disdain. As fate would have it, my first trip to Rome coincided with the first anniversary of her passing. I brought some of her ashes with me, thinking I would be able to fulfill one of her life's dreams. But once I was on the Vatican grounds, it didn't feel right. Too much exhibition, surveillance, spectacle, and ostentation, so I refrained. The next day I just happened across the Pantheon, which Rome is like that. You're walking around and then all of a sudden you bump into this like 2,000-year-old building. This monument to the gods, magnificent both in its splendor and its resilience, and I knew immediately that's where she belonged. In the end, in the beginning, Indigenous elders come of and return to land, a site of perpetual and perennial memory that will never be lost. I have a few slides to end here. My dad recently, we brought some of my mom's ashes back home, so this is him. He's got 3 brothers. I think the youngest is 82 and my dad's 88. And the youngest is 83, my dad's 88. And just to give you some idea, let's see if I can pull this off, of the kind of role they play, I think, within the family and their community, and how they both, it just seems like the older they get, the more empowered they get. And the greater respect, I think, is afforded to them within their communities and families in a variety of ways. So I'm just going to pay really briefly. This is like what some of our traditional dances looks like. I'm just going to pause for a second and then I'll show you my uncle. Okay. Okay, so that's some of what it might look like in full regalia. Alright, I only meant to play that for like a second. Yay! So, one of my dad's brothers, well, they're all hilarious, but one of them loves to dance. And requires that everybody learn their traditional huelas. So how do I, okay. So this is him with his granddaughter at this birthday party for my dad. Nope. He's 86. Thank you. Yeah, he's 86, and he requires, a couple of things I think are interesting there is that he definitely requires, by getting different people up to learn the Hawaiians, to learn the dances. And then often, you might have heard in the background, but there's times too when my dad was around that they'll always say, "You're so strong. What? You're so strong." And they will say over and over how strong somebody is in ways that I think are really purposeful. What else do I have here? This is the Pantheon. I literally left ashes of my mom somewhere in surprise. There was security everywhere, but somehow I pulled it off. And I just love knowing that she's there with the dots, because she definitely saw herself as that powerful. Here's some elders, still protecting land, very politically active, and I will leave it there.
I'll start with this question. Somebody printed out.
Okay.
Can you tell us more about some of the implications of your work or comments today for practitioners and advocates? What would be your primary suggestions for those who are wanting to understand how to translate your ideas into their work, whether in medicine, mental health, or social services, law, policy?
Well, in reading some of the really limited research and studies on this, I think one of the things that was really important to me was that distinction between elderly and elders. And so when conducting research or working within Indigenous communities, these researchers who did go out and were clearly influenced by the work of people who talk about methodology. You see certainly your work, Linda Smith's work. Rather than just ask for data and who's over 65, they asked within the community, who are your elders? And they were astounded by it. Sometimes it would be people in their 30s and 40s, and then it would be really older people, and then there would be older people that would not necessarily include it because they might not have been living in a good way or a balanced way. So I think for issues of practice and research, that's something that really came out to me as just not, I guess just to make that distinction.
This kind of follows up on that question, which is for larger practitioners and stuff, but for Indigenous communities, have you done research with various reservation communities or even off-urban Indian communities that might have different kinds of elder care or different, I think of the Cat3 circles, right, that Clementine's involved with, that is older women primarily that have, I think there's all different kinds. We can think about different kinds of reservation or communities or urban Indian communities and that. Are you planning on extending your research into, how do we implement what you're saying, a non-capitalist regime of elder care work?
Yeah. I would love to. I think, again, this is so new, but I do think about, what support grant or otherwise would be, so I could actually formalize a research project and ask. And some of the few studies I read, it's a challenge because they noticed real distinctions between urban communities who are more subject to the kind of dominant system and rural, or quote unquote more traditional communities. And when we just recently went home, that really spoke to me in a different way, in that I realized, so because my dad can't, he's 88, so we went about as close to home as we could, but he couldn't handle altitude. So actually everybody came to Lima. None of us had really been to Lima, so that was a project in and of itself, but we figured it out. But typically they all live, so there's no real need in some ways of institutional care because they all live in close proximity to each other. And one of his brothers, and they talk about how they go from home to home, and one of his brothers in particular has a daughter who recently moved to Florida. And she's like, I keep telling my dad to come visit me and he won't come. And he's like, why won't he come? And he said, because there's nobody there to party with. He's like 84. But he's wife. So two of my dad's brothers are married to two sisters. So it's all quite overly sweet. But one, even though his wife is still alive, he only lives with his wife on the weekend. And the rest of the time he travels around, and he just, mostly with his daughters, so it's very gendered. But he is sort of an active consumer of how he wants to be cared for, which is just, really interesting to me. But it's clear that with the various removals and dispossessions, that kind of way isn't really possible for so many people. So I do need to start thinking more deeply. And certainly my experience with my own mom and bringing her through the healthcare system, that is so dehumanizing. Typically, though there's pockets you can find everywhere, which is amazing. But, I think that's going to be one of the central problematics of our time, and not because, we're going to lose global superpower. But I think there's lots of other things to be gained.
I know that you have said that this work is sort of new, so you may not have thought this far about it, but I'm wondering if, in thinking about dementia versus mind elsewhere, do you suggest that would change the treatment or the prescriptions in the way that it's treated now, and compared to how it's treated now?
I would hope so in some ways. I haven't really thought, but I think it's just so, the discourse around it is so much disease-centered. And lots of people have suggested I look at critical disability studies, which I haven't had time to look at that literature, but I'm sure there's lots of insights there. Because it even shifted my own thinking in some ways when I would struggle, because it's very hard work, so I don't want to overly romanticize, but if I could get myself to a point to kind of recognize that she was working through something as opposed to being diseased or being close to death as a kind of finitude as opposed to like a rebirth of something else. It shifted my own care for her in the way I understood the experience. And certainly within the hospice model, where it isn't so much about curing something, but helping who's ever caring for the individual to just, alleviate pain, but otherwise just be supportive, is a much better model than let's fix it, let's put another drug in, let's try this, let's try this. So I don't know what the implications of that, but it's a good question.
I don't know if this might just be like a continuation of the thought that's happening here. But I was wondering if like the redemption experience might just be that, like exactly what you're talking about. And so my personal experience was with my mother who got brain damage in a car accident and went through a lot of the same things that you went through. I think that our interactions in this time when we lived was a working through for her, even though she wasn't present in the same way, and a working through for me and my fears of her dying and my fears of her never coming back in a, capitalist sort of perception, and that shifted her mental state, that shifted my mental state, and it was traumatic and all of these things that I think are easy to describe. But I really just want to hang on to the redemption thing because I got to get access to memories of hers that she didn't feel were, when I was younger, didn't feel were important to tell me about where she was from. And I got to have access to sort of linguistic little tokens and moments that maybe she didn't think I would understand, but now that she was in whatever place that she was in, she thought it was important to share with me. I don't know, I think that the caretaking literature and all this stuff is very eager to separate these, like the person that's taking care of this person suffers, and then the person that's being taken care of is going through this thing. But I was hoping maybe that maybe you could respond to the idea of like the redemption actually being right at the center of multiple experiences, like 2 people or 3 people or everybody, and yeah, I don't know.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it is, so much of it is just subtractive, like what did you lose, you're stressed out, you're this, you're that, without, And it is all those things, but it's like, but it's also deeply redemptive. And you know, there'll be times when, you know, in terms of getting back to the shift, if I was trying to move her from one repetitive thought or whatever, there was always just resistance. But then eventually, and not all the time, but if you could just go with it, it was just a really different, you know, response. And just wherever she was, you just went there with her. And then, I mean, I have to say some of the memories also, half of which we wouldn't know were real or not, but then later, I mean, the other half, we found out. I mean, there was even this story about her in school, and, you know, she always imagined herself as like, you know, a top student. She was always the best, you know. And we went to this school, and my dad's like, I don't think she really went to school here. I'm like, well, she talked about it, let's go. So we went, and there was like a plaque. We were floored. There was a plaque on the wall with her name on it, of like the list of, and we like could not believe it, because none of us really believed she went to school. So my dad's like, I have no idea how she came, you know, and so I don't know what other of the stories. I mean, clearly some things. I know she didn't, you know, go to the Oval Office and hang out with President Obama. That much I know. But there's a point in their life where somebody said, I think they imagined life as they wanted to live it. So she saw herself as very powerful, and, you know, she would talk about him, like, and she'd say, he's so handsome, he's even more handsome in person than he is on TV. And you're like, you know, just like, wow, that's great, Mom. She, you know, explained in vivid detail the Oval Office and like their conversation, and, you know, it's really an amazing journey if you can find the strength to go with it.
I was also wondering about you make, and I'm wondering how central it is to the overall piece, this critique of self-care, which I think is really interesting, because you hear about self-care coming out of you know, people who give so much to various social movements, to the point of exhausting themselves and then needing to take time, right? And so, but this critique of it is also an extension of a neoliberal logic of the individual self, and why is it that caring for others, we don't feel it's as replenishing as taking care of ourselves is. So I just wanted to know if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, there was actually, in a really different way, there was a pretty recent piece in The Atlantic about self-care tied to like, that people feel entitled to now as a sort of a commodity to purchase, so you deserve that massage. So it's like purposefully put into the discourse as part of like a capitalist regime. But I was thinking about it a little bit differently, but I do think if you talk about self-care too, the other, I think, operating assumption is that the community is not caring for you, right? And if we had really intact models or visions of community care, if I saw somebody, and I talk about this now with my students who are, you know, student activists on campus, that they are responsible to each other. So if somebody is floundering, exhausted, whatever, it's their responsibility as a group to care for that person, as opposed to like, oh, you need to go do some self-care. Not helpful. So, and you know, even that kind of little bit of a shift. So I think I do see it as part of like the dismantling of our sense of collective responsibility and mutuality in really important ways, I think. And we all talk about self-care. And it was disturbing to kind of look back at where that entered the literature. It's like, you know, and at the same time, economically, and people being in conversation with each other of these like, you know, generational fiscal cliff people and big pharma. You know, it's distressing.